So right now we're going to move along to my colleague Juliette Berg, and she's going to share with you some of the research that she's been doing in this area as well. So Juliette.
Hi everyone. So I'm going to kind of take a higher level view and talk about some of the research around social emotional learning and school climate. And I want to start with kind of some background about why this is important to think about these issues. So the Science of Learning and Development Alliance, a partnership between research policy and practice organizations, synthesize converging knowledge from the science of learning and development. The science tells a promising story of every child's potential when in intentional, well-designed, developmentally rich context. This is why attention to school climate is so important. More specifically, the science tells us the following, that the brain develops throughout life as a function of experiences that activate neural pathways. This activation permits new kinds of thinking and learning throughout life. That the kinds of experience we have are hugely important and human relationships are essential to learning and development. That adversity affects learning, development, and adult attunement, but that resilience and thriving are possible and how adults and settings respond matters. That social-emotional affective and cognitive processes are inextricably linked. They cannot be separated. And it follows that the ability of adults to attune with children, to buffer stress, and support their cognitive, social, and emotional development is key to the personalization of learning and healthy development. So from the science, the SOLD Alliance developed a set of 4 core practice principles to drive effective whole child practice at the system, school, and classroom levels. These are, as you can see in the wheel, supportive environments, systems of support, social and emotional development, and productive instructional strategies. And I believe you have this as a handout, so you can look at it more specifically, but each of these components contributes to positive developmental context and thriving of the whole child. Most relevant to our current topic, you can see from the wheel that based on what the science says about how young people learn and develop, it is just as important to focus on the school environment as on SEL and instructional practices. So now I want to get into what we mean by school climate and SEL and how these two components of healthy schools are interrelated. Starting with school climate, just to provide a really quick definition, it's the physical, academic, social, and disciplinary environment of the school. In addition to the research that shows positive associations between school climate and a number of academic and non-academic outcomes, research suggests that students from traditionally marginalized communities report feeling less safe, supported, and connected in school. These disparities can have detrimental effects for the school success of marginalized students, contributing to alienation and inequities in school experiences and outcomes. Building safe, supportive, connected, and culturally competent schools can help counteract these disparities. This goes back to the importance of supportive, developmentally suitable relationships I was talking about earlier. And relating to what we just heard from Ginger and Brenda, there's and other research shows that students who feel safer, more connected to school, and who have more support do better in terms of mental health and emotional well-being during transitions, for example, from middle school to high school. And SEL is a process of learning and building social and emotional competencies. These include cognitive, emotional, and social skills, such as the ones listed on the slide here. These also include beliefs, such as growth mindset and self-efficacy, values, such as ethical and performance values, and personality, such as optimism and gratitude. This set of competencies, all-inclusive, can be nurtured in supportive, developmentally rich environments with attuned relationships. If you go back to the research literature about school climate and SEL, you will find that they have traditionally been studied separately. This is in part because SEL has traditionally been implemented as programs, and this is changing, as I'll show you in a little bit. The study of school climate has traditionally involved the things that are listed in that green circle on the left, and the study and implementation of SEL have traditionally involved the things that are listed in the kind of tan orangey circle on the right. Looking at studies of school climate and SEL, in particular evaluations of programs, we do see that one benefits the other. So for example, school climate programs or approaches can improve relationship skills and promote emotion regulation in students. And SEL programs aim to, and often do, improve classroom and school climate and sense of belonging in school. Both show effects on positive behavior and academic achievement. But the research that shows these crossovers has been somewhat limited. This is perhaps because systemic SEL was not a focus until recently. The lack of a systemic approach is also perhaps why there have been a number of evaluations that have shown weaker impacts of SEL than one might have hoped. There's now a convergence in the belief that barriers to successful SEL, which we mean equitable, high-quality SEL, are systemic and need to be addressed systemically. Without addressing school climate, we will continue to have these barriers. The factors on the slide, which include systemic, institutional, and individual barriers, are some of the factors that we now understand present barriers to successful SEL, but there, of course, are others. Given this convergence on the need for systemic SEL, we can see SEL and school climate becoming more integrated. We see a significant move towards coordinated, systematic, school-wide, and district-wide programming that is ecological, integrates school climate and SEL approaches, and prioritizes the engagement of the larger school community. So as an example, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, they're a leader in this work, and they developed a model for the systemic school-wide implementation of SEL, which is shown on this slide. And I believe you also have this, hopefully as a handout, so you can, because it's a little bit small. But they have identified 4 focus areas of systemic implementation. These include that all schools begin with a strong foundation and plan for SEL. Adults have strong social and emotional competencies and are skilled at promoting students' SEL. Schools engage simultaneously in strategies that support both adult and students' SEL. And all are driven by continuous improvement that helps schools quickly learn from what they're doing and refine their efforts to ensure a high-quality implementation. And the 10 components in the model that you see to the right there provide a snapshot of what high-quality school-wide SEL implementation looks like and feels like. All of these are needed to avoid fragmentation. Now I want to talk about specifically what is at the intersection of school climate and SEL and what it means to really integrate these. So the conditions for learning, the way that we see it, are the components of school climate that are most proximal to the student and most influential for SEL. These 4 components, which you can see on the graphic on the slide, include safety at the top left there, which includes physical, emotional, and identity safety. Connectedness and belonging, the top right box, which includes, among other things, cultural competence and responsiveness. Academic challenge on the bottom left, and social emotional supports on the bottom right. And I'm not going to go into this in more specifics, but I welcome you to go to the source and to read more about this if you're interested. So going back to our graphic that I showed earlier, where we have the school climate factors on the left and the SEL factors on the right, you see that the overlap between these two are these proximal conditions for learning that are at the heart of the intersection between school climate and SEL. In the interest of time, I will illustrate just how one of these, cultural competence, produces the conditions for SEL. So in these boxes, we can see here how building one condition for learning, cultural competence, both improves school climate and builds competencies. Building cultural competence begins with self-awareness. To be culturally competent, educators must recognize how the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, and being able-bodied impact us individually. Educators must understand how identification within a particular group gives privilege in certain spaces and must be open to actively listen to marginalized groups who experience life differently because of their social groupings. This involves acknowledging personal biases and seeking to understand people with different experiences. This self-awareness can extend to students through modeling, direct instruction, and supportive relationships. This is how adults and students in the school building can develop the awareness and attuned relationships that create the conditions for learning and build positive school climates. So that's just one example. And I also want to just, this graphic is really just showing that although relationships are at the heart of the intersection between school climate and SEL, they are embedded within a set of systems that we can attend to build the right conditions. And these are all kind of interactive, they influence each other, and they occur in all settings. And by attending to all of these settings and conditions, we can build knowledge and competencies, create safe spaces for marginalized youth, and reduce the barriers to equitable SEL. And so we want to work at different levels. We want student and adult SEL programs and implementation support. We want school-wide behavioral programs and practices such as PBIS and restorative justice. We want implementation support and data systems and early warning indicators to track progress. And I believe that the next presenter, Wehmah, will go in a little bit more detail about this. So in my last slide, I want to end with some key ideas or recommendations to consider when working at the intersection of improving school climates and SEL that came out of a set of meetings with practitioners who do this work every day. These ideas can really apply to all systemic efforts, and if done at the district level, can help students transition between different schools and levels. I will not go into detail on these, but you can find more detail in the brief that I believe is included in the materials and also is at the bottom of the slide. So firstly, we want to examine all activities, including communication, assessment, and implementation of SEL and school climate programs and practices to see how well they support and promote equity. For example, maybe there is a need to develop culturally responsive resources for families and educators, or strengthen support for students who require more support. We want to ask, how can all systems that support children and youth work together over the long term? For example, we want to avoid silos, expand SEL and climate approaches beyond the school day, etc. And you can see more examples in the actual brief. We want to develop and share a clear message, common definitions, intentional goals for SEL and for school climate. We want to make sure the right people are hearing and seeing those messages. For example, we want to share information about SEL and school climate and where you are going with it. Tell stories and anecdotes. Bring together experts who can communicate and use technology to help spread the word, and customize the message, and engage skeptics. This work begins with adults. So we want to build SEL in adults and awareness of trauma. We want to develop adult skills in building the conditions for learning. We want to acknowledge and engage guidance counselors and social workers in the work that they already do. We want to provide a range of PD activities for all levels and types of educators. And we want to authentically engage students through active participation in this work and throughout the process. We also want to acknowledge that families are experts in their children's development, and we want to be aware of strategies that may be in opposition to the values or beliefs of families. We want to learn from successful efforts in your communities and determine what we still do not know. So there's a lot of good examples out there, and really it's specific to the needs of your communities. Leaders can identify and develop supports for usable, equitable, and valid assessment of SEL and school climate. Formative, well-aligned assessments are very useful. We want to align assessments with strategies and practices being used in schools, and we want to teach educators how to use their results and also share them with families. And finally, we want to capitalize on the national and international interest in SEL and social-emotional health that currently exists, So we want to act quickly and strategically. This work is so, so important. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it on to the next presenter, Wehmah Jones.
Hello, everyone. So there are a number of steps that districts are taking to create positive school climates and help students develop appropriate social-emotional competencies, and I'll be sharing some of those practices and strategies with you. The first involves improving school discipline. So we know that school climate is a reflection of how individuals experience the school setting, and student discipline influences how staff and students experience the school environment. So some districts are now working to improve their discipline policies and practices. Some of the strategies that we're seeing is that they're shifting the focus of discipline policies from punishment to prevention. Another thing that districts are doing are revising their school codes of conduct. So example revisions would include more of a focus on intervention and supports, changing the language and the tone of the document, so moving away from law enforcement language like offenses and violations and replacing it with more student-friendly language, making sure that themes related to educational and social equity, emotional and physical safety, as well as collaborative family engagement are present throughout their document, and adjusting consequences. So for example, eliminating out-of-school suspensions for minor offenses. Another thing that we've seen districts do is to try to reduce the ambiguity around consequences. So what behaviors a student can get suspended for and how long. When this ambiguity exists, administrators might have relatively wide latitude to issue suspensions of varying lengths for certain behaviors. And this can lead to some student groups getting harsher consequences than others, and it can also foster a sense of unfairness in the school community, which of course affects school climate. And then of course, just in terms of these revisions, districts are including a more diverse group of stakeholders in the process to make sure that all voices are heard. Another strategy with regard to discipline is multi-tiered supports. And I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with this approach where you have Tier 1 school-wide improvements, Tier 2 targeted supports, and then Tier 3 more intensive supports such as wraparound services or intensive support from a school counselor or social worker. And then finally, districts are trying to take a less punitive approach, so they're seeking out more positive strategies, for example, restorative practices, which are designed to hold students accountable while also building the school community, restoring relationships, and repairing harm. Other examples would be engaging in mediation, conflict resolution, and also setting up an early warning system where there's a system in place that helps to identify students who have more intensive behavioral and academic needs, and this allows them to be more proactive in delivering interventions that can prevent disciplinary actions. Another way in which districts are working to improve their school climate and support SEL is by implementing specific programs and strategies. Some of these, such as bullying prevention and PBIS, I think you all are familiar with, so in the interest of time, I won't focus on those, and I'll just talk about some of the others. With regards to school climate standards, districts are integrating school climate standards into their policies in order to operationalize what school climate actually means and then increase accountability for their school climate improvement efforts. We're also currently working with a district that has chosen to develop SEL standards to go along with their academic standards. And this is just another strategy to help ensure that there's equal emphasis placed on student social and emotional development in addition to academics. As mentioned earlier, SEL and school climate are complementary and intertwined, and so a lot of districts are adopting SEL programs which are designed to teach positive social and emotional skills. But along with these programs, they're looking at strategies for strengthening student-teacher relationships because we know that relationships are a key driver in social-emotional development. They're also looking to integrate SEL practices into the school day, which is particularly important for middle and high school, where it might be more difficult to get students who are older to buy into a program. And there's more focus on adult SEL and self-reflection. In addition, districts are focusing on trauma-sensitive approaches. So we know that trauma is fairly prevalent and is linked to social and emotional development. And so schools are now implementing trauma-sensitive approaches to support students who have experienced a traumatic life event. And these include educating all school staff about trauma and its effects on learning, promoting safety in relationships and in the environment, reducing trauma-related triggers in the school, and eliminating potentially re-traumatizing practices such as harsh and shaming responses to students' behavior, and also considering trauma in all assessment protocols and behavior plans. Schools are also supporting student and staff self-regulation related to fostering resilience. And finally, recognizing the secondary effect of trauma on educators, there's also a push to be sure that that's addressed also. Okay. And then more efforts are being made to seek out and create opportunities for students to make positive contributions to their school community, so focusing on student voice and student leadership. And so districts are now trying to create mechanisms for students to participate in decision-making at the school level. And this could be creating a school student council, creating opportunities for them to provide input into some school policies, and also sharing school climate data with them to seek out their reactions and their feedback. Next, I'll talk a little bit about culturally responsive practices, since equity is intrinsic to all aspects of school climate and the work that they're doing. Districts and school leaders are now looking at their work through an equity lens. So this means examining their policies and practices with the following question in mind. Who is being well served, and who is being left out or harmed by the policies and practices of our organization? And then there are efforts underway to create a bias-free and respectful school environment. So we've seen more districts providing implicit bias training for their staff and encouraging self-reflection on how stereotypes can influence their judgments even when they're not aware of it. And of course, they're also reviewing data to identify discipline disparities. And with regards to culturally responsive teaching, districts are engaging in culturally relevant and responsive teaching practices, such as integrating student culture and identities into their curricula, resources, and school events in order to help students feel safer and more connected to the school. There's also interagency collaborations going on within districts. So districts are partnering with healthcare partners who can now work in the schools and support the school in meeting the needs of students. And in the past, the presence of law enforcement and school resource officers has been associated with increased inclusionary discipline practices. So now they're offering specialized training on working in schools and also clarifying the roles of these individuals, setting limitations for their roles, and setting clear expectations. In addition, schools and districts are working with social service agencies to help support their students. And these agencies can offer direct services, but they also provide another perspective or insight about aspects of the school climate that schools might not have considered. They also help to connect schools with other community organizations that can offer services for students and can reinforce what the school is doing in terms of their school climate efforts. So they can help keep the messaging consistent across programs. And finally, the final strategy I'll talk about today is assessing school climate. In order to improve school climate, schools have to be able to measure it and determine where their strengths and their challenges are. And so districts now have policies in place regarding the regular assessment of school climate. in order to be effective, these measures have to be comprehensive. So they need to gather information from a representative group of students as well as staff and parents and other key stakeholders. They also need to account for various aspects of the school climate, so safety, institutional practices, school connectedness, actions and attitudes of school staff, interpersonal relationships, as well as knowledge of and perceived fairness of the rules. And it also, in terms of assessment, the data collection needs to be ongoing in order to make sure that they're getting the information that they need to act on the school's climate needs. All right, and I will turn it back over to Brenda.